So you insisting on saying that we have to have a new way of looking at what is the origin of the value being created in this economy, insisting that, so we need this new way of thinking about the origin of value. Are you doing it because you think this is the only way we can then have an economic theory that can integrate this problem with the ecology? Is this only that, or you are also doing it because that will enlighten our macroeconomic theory as well?
Both. That's why I started with that quote from Arthur Eddington, because he said, if you have a theory of anything that violates the laws of thermodynamics, you have a theory of nothing. Okay? Worse than nothing. And that's the situation of economic theory right now. Any economic theory that doesn't include energy is a nonsense theory. That's Marxist, as post-Keynesian as anything at all. So we don't actually have a valid economics yet. And that's why I say we have to have energy inside there. And that's, as it happens, the equation I worked out last year is at least the start of doing it. I want to show you can do it more than just in a neoclassical form, which the next slide. But we have to, if we have a theory of economics that isn't valid according to the laws of thermodynamics, it's not a theory. It's bullshit.
Both for growth theory and for macroeconomics.
Everything as well, growth theory and ecology and macroeconomics, Yep.
So you are going to have a macroeconomic theory where money, you deal with money.
But you also deal with energy.
Of money, and you solve the problem of having a properly grounded theory of production.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you mentioned about the energy and how it's just capital, labor, and wages combined into one, just core like a compound, and to make and to provide some kind of sufficient economic growth. But we should understand and consider that it's also just a big, huge issue that the energy, also just the scarcity of the energy and all the shortage with resources. Don't you think so? In terms of the climate change, for instance.
Because again, I haven't broken down the sources of energy yet.
Exactly. Because yesterday it was a great chance to hear the lecture of the Secretary General of the Grammy Maxim of the Global Front, And he just noted and underlined all this conception that we should just work towards diminishing some kind of climate change and some kind of heating and warming, global warming procedures across the globe, and also all this we should work towards like a sustainable development across the globe as well. So this way, I suppose that we should be very cautious about efficient usage of the whole energy. Don't you think so?
Absolutely.
So it's really just a matter of urgency, I suppose.
Definitely.
And also just by all the laws of economics, that we should understand that from time to time, just if we're going just in 20 to 30 years, there will be just more shortage of all this stuff, all these resources, like natural resources, and we should use them with some more just efficient ways.
And there's also the
usage, effective return, just like a utilization of it, and afterwards, my humble opinion, we should enable and we should use some kind of new renewable technologies or some kind of high techs, just research and innovation in this field, and it also requires a lot of expenditure afterwards and a lot of investments. Thank you.
So what I'm going to do now is I want my mouse to wake up. There we go. Okay. So if you actually look at the explicit forms here, we've got energy and technology turning up here. So that's the fundamental role of technology is now seen as increasing the amount of energy we can process or processing energy we use more efficiently in terms of production. What's happening with capital relates to profit and finance. What happens with employment relates to class power. So you've got all these things tied together in a way that I think gives us more than just an explanation for energy, though we desperately need that as well, but it's also the relationships between money, social power and so on. And this is, as the physicrats were right to base it in energy, but we can now link, if they didn't need to worry about entropy 2 centuries ago, we need to worry about it, the impact of waste desperately need to worry about it right now. So it's only the very beginning of using this equation to then look at the role of economics within the ecology. And of course, I'm not even differentiating the types of energy up here, but clearly the energy labour uses is quite different to the energy capital uses. The energy capital uses can be renewable energy, or it can be stored energy. With the stored energy, we've got all the issues of the climate change and so on. There's also the issues of how efficiently do we exploit that energy. Okay, the term, what's called energy return and energy invested, becomes an important part of the argument, and a huge part of our growth over the last 250 years is because when we first started exploiting oil in particular, we got a return of about 250 to 1. So every unit of energy going in gave 250 units of energy back. Coal has still got an enormous energy return and energy invested because it's mining coal. Even today, coal is so close to the surface, and once you've opened up a coal seam, there's so much of it that the energy return on coal is huge, but of course the pollution is equally huge. So, and we're now going across to renewable energy, but renewable energy has a much, well, it still has a pollution element, because if you look at the entire life cycle of producing photovoltaic cells from silicon all the way through, there's a large amount of carbon and a large amount of waste in that whole process as well. But it has a lower energy return and energy invested, and the point is to get a higher return over time, which is we're slightly...
Waste management, for instance, is also very important. Renewables and waste management and just recycling of all this stuff, it's also just very important to just teach us across the globe.
So all these elements are extremely important to take. What I've shown you is just the very beginning of trying to bring together an energy-aware theory of production with all the implications that has in terms of both the nature of energy and also the waste we're generating, how we're depleting resources, and so on. So a long, long way to go. I've shown you working just with the Cobb-Douglas production function form, but you could do it with a Sraffa-Leontief production form as well, and you'd have energy input vectors as well as labour input vectors as part of that. And if you work at the level of a single corn economy model, as I've been doing in those Minsky models I've done so far, then you could show output as almost exclusively a function of the energy harnessed by machinery. But really, labour these days is basically used to control machinery. Okay, there's very little actual energy input from labour into production as we define it. Maybe if you go see a physiotherapist, that's energy input that way, but it's a small amount. So if you look at the way that the post-Keynesians model, they have a fixed proportion between labour and capital, and that makes sense when the main role of the labour is to control the machinery. If you're flying in if you're flying in a jumbo jet, you've got labour input there, but the labour input is to control the machine. Okay. So putting it in that sense, you have an idea of a utilisation factor for how much of the capital is actually utilised, the capital itself, the energy it's harnessing, and then the labour just as an input to control it, and the labour being proportional in some sense to the amount of capacity that's actually being utilised. I actually should have the EK there as well. So you could start with this sort of expression for modelling in the post-Keynesian sense. You could say there's energy output as a function of the energy at a particular point in time, which is the amount of capacity being utilised, the amount of capital actually harnessed, the energy itself, the efficiency, and so on, and then labour being related to the actual throughput of energy. So I've got it correct in that particular equation, and energy growing exponentially over time. So I've done that very, very, very preliminary way with the Minsky model. I think I've got it linked inside here. So you just go back again. So you've got output as a function of energy harnessed by machinery, labour proportional to the exergy throughput of machinery, and the energy input to machinery growing exponentially over time. So I'll put that together in a very basic Minsky model, and I'll see if I can actually find that before I go on. I think I stored it in this. Where's the mouse again? Come on, okay. I didn't store it there. Where did I put the damn thing? I'll just do a bit of a search here, pardon me. Okay, this is a muck around with Goodwin. This is a Goodwin model using energy. So what I've got in this now is I have energy growing exponentially over time, and then output being a function of the energy, throughput, all the terms I've shown you there beforehand, generating output, and divide by how many units of labour are needed to work with that machinery. Everything else turns up. Now, it's not a complete model yet, but if I simulate this model to show you the behaviour, you get the same sort of cyclical behaviour. It's unstable because I really should be relating capital to the energy throughput, which has both got the capital component and the energy per unit of capital component. So it's not a completely correct model, but you can actually build a Minsky, a Goodwin model, and also Minsky ultimately, including the role of energy. So it's quite straightforward to do it. It's not a huge leap to get there. But what I want to now do is take a look at these the existing theories of production using this idea of the role of energy. And when you look at it, production is a process by which you take free energy and transform matter or energy into a lower entropy form, which is more organised. And it necessarily generates more entropy by the second law. So waste production, the total waste production exceeds the entropy reduction, so you have to have material waste turning up as well. And labour and capital are just adjuncts to doing all that. So you can't exploit free energy without labour and machinery, but they can't add value in their own right either. Okay? So we have to look at what we've actually had a series of production so far, and that includes Marx. So I'm going to show now an energy-based reason why the labour theory of value just does not make sense. Because what it argues is that surplus is proportional to the labour input. That's the fundamental argument. So there's your now seeing it. How do we put it in terms of this Cobb-Douglas production function? But equally, I could use the post-Keynesian form I used a moment ago to take a look at it. But there's your labour input, which is the number of unskilled labourers. There's the energy input per worker. There's the number of machines, and there's the energy per machine, and the exergy ratio and the efficiency. Now, how do you express Marx's claim that labour is the source of value in that equation? Well, the XL ratio is the ratio of surplus, which you might say is 2,000 calories a day, to total labour, which might be 4,000 calories per day. So I can call that S over V in Marx's terms. So I can then rework it, and I then find the energy contribution of labour, a couple of cancellations apply, ends up being V multiplied by S over V. So the energy input of labour is S, which is 2,000 calories a day, times how efficiently those calories are employed. If we put it in constant returns to scale terms, that's now a reworking of the equation to include Marx's concepts. Now, if Marx says that a machine cannot add any more than its value to production, that means the exergy ratio for the machine must be 0. Okay? So the numerator is the work done which is greater than the cost of producing the machine, and according to Marx that's 0. All you get back is what you put in. So xk has to be 0. So what happens when you put that in the equation? Well, either you get output as 0. If you have if you have alpha greater than 0, then that whole term is going to be 0, because you're told here's the energy. The xk is 0 there, raised to the alpha. You get 0. The only way you can get a non-zero output is say the exponent itself is 0. And then if you do it, your conclusion becomes that GDP is equal to the number of workers, unskilled workers, times 1,000 calories a day times the efficiency of doing it, which is just, the best way to explain that is call that total bullshit. GDP is slightly more than 1,000 calories per day per head. Okay? This is what we had before we even invented production. This is the labour theory of value works in a world where we don't even have tools. Okay? It's not a serious theory of value. It's empirically absurd. And there's many other ways that Marx has been critiqued on that front. But I argue the labour theory of value itself is a mistake, that Marx actually gave us a reason to reject. And when you look at the reason he gave us to reject it, you can make it compatible with the ecological stuff I've shown you just a moment ago. Because what Marx, as well as having the labour theory of value, Marx was originally a philosopher. His PhD was in philosophy, not economics. And he wasn't trained by Hegel, he was trained by descendants of Hegel, or inheritors of Hegel's ideas. And people have this vision of, have you heard about the idea of the dialectic being thesis, antithesis, synthesis? That's not Marx. I did my master's thesis on Marx something like 25 years ago, and I was reading, I had my own version, my interpretation of Marx, which by reading Capital, I'd worked out what I thought was Marx's logic long before I did my master's degree. I did it back when I was an undergraduate in 1973, and I couldn't find any of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis stuff. It forms impossible to pronounce. You end up with a lisp if you try to say it too often. But I couldn't find it anywhere in anything I read by Marx. Yeah.
By the way, maybe you know that it was released by BBC from Britain, some kind of economics documentary series about 2 or 3 years ago. It's called like a Masters of Money, you know. And one of these, it's got about 3 series in it. And in one of these series, it dedicated exactly to the Marx theory of economics, you know.
Well, it's not Marx's, but the thesis, antithesis, synthesis is not Marx's dialectic. It belongs to a guy called Fichte. Okay? So I read everything Marx ever wrote in economics during my master's thesis. And what I picked up was this sort of argument. The Marx had what I call foreground, background and dialectical tension. And I finally found a book by a philosopher, a guy called Michael Wilde, a book called Marx and Contradiction. And that's the best book I've seen summarising Marx's philosophy, which Marx never wrote down completely clearly, but it was this idea of, it wasn't thesis, antithesis, synthesis, it was foreground, background, tension. And I'll show you the logic behind it. See, Marx's idea was, and this comes from Hegel as well,
Yeah? My apologies for the disturbance. Did you send the bullet points?
Pardon?
Did you send the bullet points?
Yes.
Did you receive them? Which
Yes.
address did you send them? Because you haven't received them.
No, I sent them about 30 minutes ago to Exploring Economics.
To the Summer Academy at Exploring Economics?
Pardon?
To the Summer Academy at Exploring Economics?
Oh, I think sent Exploring Economics. I'll just check and see where I sent it to, if I can find the sent. I can't, hang on. I did send it.
Because we haven't received it. It's just that...
Yeah, well, I did, hang on a sec, let's see. Sent, let's see. Outbox. Oh, there we go. It didn't actually get sent to you. Bring it back to me.
so I just press send, or...
Well, it's the internet here is shit house. So I tried sending it to you. Let's, hang on. Copy it. So I sent it to you guys, but it didn't get sent from. I'll send it from. Let's see if I can find your email. Hang on.
If it doesn't work, their address is already here. So that's good. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not finding. Can you type the address in there?
Okay, I'll do that.
All right. Okay. So this is Marx's dialectic. It says any component of a society is a unity. Okay. It has an existence in its own right, but it's embedded in a society. And what society will do is focus upon some component of that unity. So there's a foreground aspect of the unity that society focuses upon. Now that necessarily pushes the rest of that unity into the background. Okay. Now the unity can't exist without its background. Okay. So there's a tension between the foreground and the background. And that tension can transform this unity over time and transform society as well. Okay? Done? Good. Okay. So that's the basic logic, and that makes far more sense than thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Doesn't lead anywhere. You can put anything you bloody well like in those brackets, and that's what you find people doing. Because foreground, background and tension, it's much more sensible. It gives you a way in which you can actually organise ideas. And that's what I found Marx actually did. So this is my visual model of it. You have his society, there's your unity, Society focuses upon some foreground aspect of the unity, pushing it into the foreground, but the background has to exist, and there's going to be a tension. Yeah?
Is this tension in the society itself or in
in the unity itself, and also therefore in society? There'll be a feedback between the two.
Can we take an example? Like,
yeah,
let's assume that the unity is...
Well, let's look at what we talked about in terms of energy a moment ago. Okay, there's energy in the universe. Human society exists in the universe. The foreground of this is we can exploit available energy. The background is we have to generate waste to do it. The tension between the two gives us ecological and social sustainability issues. That's one way of looking at it. And the fundamental one that Marx was talking about is the creation of value. Okay, and he actually spoke about this. Marx was writing at the time we were forming the concepts of thermodynamics, and he was a polymath and an omnivore. He read everything. Okay? So he and Engels were reading and discussing all the work on thermodynamics. And at one point in Capital, there's a footnote where he says the following: creation of value is transformation of labour power into labour. Labour power itself is energy transferred to a human organism by means of nourishing matter. Okay, so there's an awareness there, but he didn't quite integrate it fully. He never put it into because he was trying to hang on to the labour theory of value, he never put this in systematically. If he had, the labour theory of value would have disappeared because he would have made energy the basis. Now, post-Keynesians in general have looked at the whole value disputes between neoclassicals and classical economists back in the 19th century and said, we just don't want to go there. Okay, and one of my good friends in economics and one of my examiners, my PhD, Jeff Harcourt, argues what he called horses for courses approach, saying basically post-Keynesians just use whatever's appropriate. There's no theory of value unifying our arguments. And that's okay, but you're saying you're agnostic. Well, if you're agnostic, why do you worry about methodology so much? Why just use whatever's available? And they've got methodological critiques of neoclassical economics all the way through, criticising methodology. So horses for courses doesn't really go well with a strong interest in methodology at the same time. There's a bit of a contradiction and not a dialectical one there. And as Roger Backhouse argued, well, if you're methodological agnostic, why do you always reject everything neoclassicals do? Okay? So it's hard to make this horses for courses consistent with the actual behaviour of post-Keynesian economists. And there was an alternative, attempt to develop an alternative, which Roy Rotham in particular, and actually Winslow, I think it's Ted Winslow, did a lot of work on. And they argued that Keynes had an underlying philosophy they called organicism. And this arose from Whitehouse's work. And in Winslow's characterisation of it, the essential characteristics of any entity are the outcome of its relations with other entities. Does that sound like something I've just shown you? Including complex systems for that matter, okay, as well as Marx's dialectics. And what Winslow argues, and this comes from Whitehead's philosophy as well, is that the reductionist philosophy of neoclassicism tries to explain everything from the behaviour of individual entities, not their relationships with other entities. It tries to reduce it to the behaviour of the individual consumer, aggregate that to the market, individual firm, aggregate that to supply. Okay, it's not looking at the relations between those entities, without which you can't actually define the entire system to begin with. But that then gives you the problem. How do you explain everything when everything depends upon everything else? And that's the justification neoclassicals use for reductionism. Reduce it all to small bits and add it up. Okay, that's how they interpret reductionism. But what Whitehead said was there's a nested hierarchy. Okay, there's a way in which one level can be ignored because it's in the overall context of another level, and then you include that other level and you expand your analysis. So organicism says there's the wider context that we're all human beings is not going to change during the life of capitalism. Okay, but the fact that us are entrepreneurs may change over time. So you take what's given in the context of a narrow area, and then you expand it when you get to the wider area. So the entrepreneurial function might change over the next 5 years, but we're not going to worry about humanity evolving over the next 5 years. Okay. Okay, so you ignore the wider context while you're looking at the narrower one. And that's compatible with Marx's Hegelian philosophy. So Marx, a lot of people argue you should ignore Marx's philosophy. I think they're wrong. Flat out wrong. I remember teaching a course once with a colleague at New South Wales University on Marx, and he interjected and said to the students they shouldn't read the first 7 chapters of Capital, it's just too confusing, ignore those first 7 chapters, which I thought was weird. Then I found that's the same thing that, what's his name, some popular philosopher from the 1970s, he talked about praxis. I've forgotten his name, which I think is justifiable.
Where did it come from?
Pardon?
Where did it come from?
French, praxis.
Is it Foucault?
Pardon?
Is it Foucault?
Might be Foucault. I think it's Foucault. It's partly Foucault, but it's also another fairly popular Marxist philosopher. But he also argued ignore the first 7 chapters of Capital. Now, if you look in the first 7 chapters, you find the use value, exchange value dialectic. Okay? If you ignore the first 7 chapters, you start with the labour theory of value. You don't start with how Marx tried to derive the labour theory of value. So I go, that's a huge mistake to ignore that philosophy. So this is the thesis, synthesis, stuff, which is what people normally think it's all about. But I think it's actually this combination of this organicism, which is implicit, but when you read his work, you can see this phrasing being used all the time. And I think it gets rid of all that. I've repeated myself there, pardon me. But it gets rid of all this nonsense, including the labour theory of value. And the Grundrisse is by far the work where you'll find most of Marx's use of this logic, because there's a historical accident that occurred at this time. That is, I don't think I might mention in the slides here, but Marx was the Grundrisse means rough draft. So it's the rough draft of Capital, and Marx was rereading all the classical economists to prepare for writing for Capital. And in the middle of it, I think it was Otto Brer who turned up at Marx's house with Marx's copy of Hegel's philosophy of right. So Marx reread Hegel in the middle of doing all this by accident, and in terms of the Grundrisse, it was about page 250 of the Penguin edition, where that turns up in his notes, and you can see a complete transformation in Marx's thinking at that point. It's quite a remarkable thing when you read it. It contradicts the labour theory of value, and it's compatible with the thermodynamic stuff I've been taking you through beforehand. It gives you multiple interacting price levels, and it switches between objective and subjective valuations at different levels. And you can get this idea of complex dynamics of income distribution as well. And it occurred in 1857. So this is the idea of have society with the unity embedded inside it, where society focuses upon some aspect of it, of the unity, therefore putting it in the foreground, meaning the other aspects go into the background, and there's therefore a tension. That's the basic logic that I use to describe it. And this is Marx writing about it when he first realised it. This is about page 267 in a footnote in the Grundrisse. It's shown as a footnote because it was just his way of organising this massive set of handwritten notes that Marx was writing as he's reading all these books again. And suddenly he's got this double, I imagine what he did was double asterisk, double star, you know. So the editors put this as footnote. Is not value to be conceived as the unity of use value and exchange value. In it for itself, is value the general form as opposed to use value and exchange value as particular form. So it's breaking value to use value and exchange value. Does this have significance in economics? This is clearly a brainwave for Marx at this point. It's a revelation. Does not use value enter into the relation with capital and labour? The different forms, ground rent, effective seasons on raw material productions. If, in other words, all his logic beforehand has just been in terms of exchange value. Now he's saying, if only exchange value enters, then how do elements related to use value turn up? How is it the physical composition of the cell suddenly drops out of the sky in Ricardo? It's a real brainwave. He's writing these notes for himself. This wasn't intended for publication. It's Marx saying, my God, I've just realised something really important here. This is not in the slightest bit contradicted by the fact that exchange value is the predominant. So this is the foreground and background type logic as well. And then he says the only use, and then when he's trying to work out, I've jumped a bit here, saving a bit of time in terms of slides. What he's trying to say is, how do we work out where value comes from? And he says that the only use of this, which can stand opposite capital, This is the idea of the opposition, use value, exchange value, foreground, background. The opposite of capital can't be a particular commodity. It must be all commodities. Now that contradicts the labour theory of value. I'll take you through the logic of that in a moment. But he fell back into the habit of saying, as commodities, everything, all things, therefore, resolve to labour. Therefore, he thought he was consistent with the labour theory of value. But to look at the logic properly, it's inconsistent. He starts by saying the only use value which can form an opposite to capital, in my point, is energy. That's the only thing which is you can resolve everything to, not labour but energy. That's my own addition there. So I think Marx has had an incredible philosophical advance, but he made a mistake in applying it. And this is Marx talking about what one should do when a philosopher makes a mistake. He said this is actually used from his PhD thesis on Hegel, where he talks about inverting Hegel, rather than the ideal dominating the real dominates the ideal. He said it's conceivable a philosopher can be guilty of this or this inconsistency. He made himself be conscious of it. Okay? He said, but he's not conscious that this is because he hasn't adequately grasped his own principles. So that's the case. It's the job of his followers to illuminate his own superficial expression. And that's how progress can occur.
I don't understand.
What Marx is saying is a philosopher might work out a great idea and fail to apply it adequately because he doesn't understand his own idea fully. And therefore what his followers should do is fix that up, which is what I think I'm doing. Whereas the other Marxists are trying to hang on to the labour theory of value. Okay? And he said this is not critiquing the philosopher, but it's taking his ideas and pushing them forward. So it's okay to criticise Marx, which causes horror reactions in other rooms here. So I think it's compatible with Marx on the argument. He didn't include energy in his own logic, but I can see ways, as I showed you that example earlier, because at some points he critiques Ricardo for saying the value of minerals reflects the labour that's gone into producing them. But his point is, well, Ricardo never uses the word utility, value for utility. Okay? So if he's saying that the value of the coal in a mine which hasn't yet been exploited reflects the value of the labour that's gone into it, there's no labour. So he says the only way invalidates this entire doctrine of value. Or does value mean here the possible use value and hence prospective exchange value of the coal or stone? So he's critiquing Ricardo. Ricardo tried to explain the value of coal in a mine which hasn't yet been exploited. How do you put a price on it? And Ricardo said, it's reflecting the value of the coal. But Marx's point here, there is no value of the coal. Before you actually dig a hole in the ground, there's no labour that's gone into the coal. Therefore, the value in labour terms is zero. So the value you must be talking about must be its use value. And its use value is what you think you can sell it for, prospective exchange value. So this Marx's, if you look at how Marx got to his arguments, he began as a philosopher. He was denied academic posts because he became radical, worked for left-wing left-wing newspapers instead, covered peasants being kicked out of the Black Forest by the enclosure movements in Prussia at the time, felt that philosophy didn't help him understand it, so he decided to study economics. And he did that when he was exiled from Prussia to France, and he developed the labour theory of value as he read this English economists in 1844. He said his ambition was to combine German philosophy with French politics and English economics. That's what he was trying to do. And he took these huge notes of Smith and Ricardo and Say, which have been published as the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. And again, they weren't intended for publication. They were his own notes as he was writing up his own ideas about what he was reading. And you can see how much he was resistant to what he was reading about Smith and Ricardo. So he starts off by saying the capitalist makes a profit first on the wages and second on the raw materials. And of course, according to the labour theory of value, you can only make a profit on the wages. Okay? And he was antagonistic. This political party seems to acknowledge man, but it throws aside this hypocrisy, comes out of complete cynicism by talking about labour as the sole essence of wealth and showing the theory to be anti-human. So he's really rebelling. He doesn't like what he's reading at this stage. And then he's talking about utilitarianism. When he's trying to apply, he's still a philosopher. He's still well and truly affected by his philosophical writings. So he's saying, talking about the debate between Ricardo and Say, he says, there'd be no production without consumption. He says, use the terms of things value. That's neoclassical. Okay. Poverty, and again, extravagance and thrift, luxury and privation, wealth and poverty are equal. In other words, these are dialectical opposites. And then this is so much, you can see what's writing here, this is very much philosophical writing. It's very much affected by his time doing his PhD. He's still thinking as a philosopher in a dialectical Hegelian sense at this stage. This is all in my master's thesis in a couple of papers I published back in 1993. But what you can see over time is he starts to become more and more persuaded by Ricardo, and all the stuff about dialectic starts to disappear, and the comments on use value also start to disappear. And this comes out most clearly when he critiques, this was intended for publication. He tried to explain to Proudhon, who was a French anarchist, therefore French politics, he tried to explain dialectics and economics to Proudhon. And Proudhon wrote a book called The Poverty of Philosophy. And Marx was so pissed off by it, he wrote a reply called The Philosophy of... Proudhon wrote The Philosophy of Poverty. And Marx was so pissed off by what he wrote that Marx replied with a book called The Poverty of Philosophy. And when you see what he wrote there, you will see a very, very different piece of nature. This is Proudhon attempting to explain what he thought the dialectic was, as explained to him by Marx. So he said, economists have explained the double character of value, but they've not set out its contradictory nature. It's a small matter to signal an utility value and exchange value, this astonishing contrast. Very, very French, flowery writing. He said, it's necessary to show this profound mystery. In technical terms, use value and exchange value are in an inverse ratio, the one to the other. This is Proudhon trying to apply what he thought was the dialectic. Now, Marx was quite contemptuous here. And look at the language and how he critiques Proudhon says, we will leave to the reader to compare the precise, clear and simple language of Ricardo with the rhetorical efforts made by Monsieur Proudhon in order to arrive at the determination of relative value by labour time. Ricardo shows us the real movement of the constitutes value. Monsieur Proudhon makes abstractions, struggles to invent new processes, which is only the theoretical existing of expression of what Ricardo does. Ricardo takes his point of departure, existing society. Monsieur Proudhon takes the departure value. The determination of value by labour time is for Ricardo the law of exchange value. For Monsieur Proudhon is the synthesis of use value and exchange value. He's now contemptuous of philosophy. And he accepted this distinction that the classical school made between use value and exchange value. This is from Smith. One is value and use, the other is value and exchange. And initially he said value exchange value alone determines price. And this is from Ricardo. Utility is the classical school rejected utility completely. And Marx is accepting this rejection early on. He's saying utility is not the measure of exchangeable value. Of course, in neoclassical theory it is. Marginal utility and marginal cost, they both play a role. The classical school rejected that. And Ricardo said it's the cost of production which ultimately regulates the price and not proportion between supply and demand. So again, very different to what you've learned in neoclassical theory. This is Ricardo in quite a bit of detail. Diminish the cost of production, the price will ultimately fall to the new natural price, whether demand doubles or trebles. Diminish the cost of subsistence, and the price of labour will fall to the price of subsistence. And Marx completely accepted that. So what he's saying is use value is a prerequisite to exchange, but it plays no role in setting exchange value. And use value is normally qualitative, okay, not quantitative. So the use value of a chair is that it's not how comfortable it makes you feel. It's just the fact that you can sit in it that matters. It's not the comfort that you get out of it. And exchange value, according to Marx and Ricardo, is set by the labour time necessary for production. So what Marx advances was explaining how profit can emanate without breaking away from saying everything exchanges at its cost of production. And what Marx critiqued Ricardo for is that Ricardo starts from the actual facts. He says the value of labour is smaller than the value it creates. It's a fact, but how it arises, he doesn't explain. Why is there a difference between the two? This is Marx critiquing Ricardo's own logic. And Marx's explanation, which is based on Ricardo's logic, is there's something unique about labour. Profit arises because there's a difference between the cost of production of labour power, which is means of subsistence, and the productive capacity of labour. This is the worker receives his means of subsistence, the capitalist receives in its returns for that labour. The creative power is greater than the means to keep it alive. So that was his Ricardian logic, and it gave rise to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, inevitability of crises, and socialism. But it also gave the transformation problem and the failure of those predictions of the terminal decline of capitalism. So, and it conflicts with the laws of thermodynamics, because as I said, you can't produce a surplus without energy, and machinery is clearly converting energy into useful work, but you can transcend that, all those problems in Marx, with this Hegelian logic. And this again is the point I've just shown you a moment ago. This is quoting from, I think, Ernst Mandel. He said, if you look in Marx's letters to Engels back in 1858, he says that in the method of treatment of the mere accident that I glance over Hegel's logic, not philosophy of right, he said it's undeniable this was an enormous part of the change in logic that occurred in the Grundrisse, talking in terms of commodity and money, use value and exchange value, etc., was stimulated by rereading Hegel 13 years after he'd ceased reading philosophy. Okay, from 1844 to 1857, he was embedded completely in reading economic literature. He'd forgotten his philosophical language. Now it came back to him again, and he managed to integrate the two. So the essence here is the commodity is seen as the essential unity in Marx, as he actually writes that. And capitalism focuses upon the exchange value of the commodity. But the commodity can't exist without its use value, which goes into the background. Therefore, there's a tension between the two. Now, because you focus upon exchange value, that sets price. That formalises Ricardo's argument about the long-run cost of production, setting the value. But there's still going to be a tension between the use value and the exchange value of a commodity. And Marx, and this is the long footnote again, I'll take you through it once more, just more slowly, have a read of it. So he's saying in simple exchange or barter societies, there's no particular economic content to the exchange of use values. So in that case, you can ignore use value, you can ignore exchange value, in fact, in primitive societies. But does this not develop into a system of needs and production? Does not use value enter into the form itself, for example, in the relation between capital and labour? If only exchange value plays a role, then how could elements relating to use value turn up later? Pardon me, it was too fast.
Not the first time.
Typical me, I read fast and I speak fast. Some things I do slowly, but I won't tell you about those. Okay. So suddenly use value must be included as part of the logic now. This is a huge advance over Ricardo and Smith. Okay? He's integrating the two aspects of the commodity in a way they never did. And he says Proudhon's nonsense. Okay? So he's saying what Proudhon said was nonsensical, he's going to do it properly. Which is what you're then seeing turning up in Capital, which is why you've got to read those first 7 chapters. As tedious as they are, that's where this logic turns up. And it became a fundamental element of how he organised his thinking after this point. But he made one mistake, and that's in applying it to the productivity of machinery.
The use value for Marx, could it not be seen all as the use value of a commodity is how much are you willing to pay for it?
No, partially yes, that does turn up at one stage, but what it comes down to is actually where profit comes from initially. Then it does turn up in terms of what you're willing to pay, but that's, if you look at what Marxists have considered, they've really looked at how you produce a surplus. Mm-hmm. So they've got what they call the commodity money. Another commodity doesn't produce a surplus, but money, commodities, money does produce a surplus. But that's only a physical surplus. To turn it into actual money, you've got goods you've produced, you've got to sell them. Mm-hmm. And if they don't have utility, then you're not going to achieve, and that's got to be utility both in terms of usefulness, but also in terms of how they relate to aggregate demand. Yeah. So it turns up as a sense in aggregate demand as well. Okay. So what you find, fortunately Marx wrote, he wrote a book by a guy called Adolf Wagner, who was a Austrian economist, and it was Wagner's attempt to explain Marx, and Marx thought it was total crap, and he wrote these things in the marginal, in the notes, like writing on the edge of the book. So this is now published as called Marginal Notes on Adolf Wagner, and you can actually see how he said you can't leave, if you use value out of my thinking, you don't understand me at all. This is back in the Grundrisse again. Exchange value and use value are brought into relation. Capital signs on one side is exchange, labour is, etc., etc. So he's trying to work out now, how do we tie these two logics together? How do we look at the logic of the use value and the exchange value of the commodity? And so this again, if you compare this to what he wrote in the Critique of Proudhon, and also to what we wrote back in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, he's now integrating this idea of use value and exchange value in a way that he couldn't do in the philosophical manuscripts, and he critiques Proudhon's attempt at it, but he's now doing it properly.
If I may simplify the story, just to see how far off I will be by trying to simplify it to understanding at the first level. So, is it the case that, in fact, what is happening is that with Ricardo, the price of a commodity is mainly determined by the cost of producing it, and that's it for Ricardo. He looks only at the supply as determined by the cost structure of producing it, at a time where the neoclassics say the price of a commodity is determined, yes, by those cost factors, but also by the willingness of people to pay a certain price to acquire, depending on their preference. So for the neoclassical, the price is determined both by the supply and by the demand. And Marx, in fact, is also a little bit saying the same thing, that you cannot ignore the demand side.
But this is where the different layers come in. So the first layer is how you explain how a surplus is produced, and that's energy versus exploiting energy. The next thing is how do you generate that surplus in production, which is capital versus labour.
How is the surplus split?
How's the surplus split? Then later, how do you actually realise that surplus, which is where you invert the significance. Use value matters more than exchange value now. Doesn't matter how much it costs to produce something, if you can't get aggregate demand for it, you're not going to turn that physical surplus into money. So there's a whole series of layers, like a series of onions, going further and further out, and you can show all of them using that visual model. So he starts from the idea that there's capitalist society with a commodity where exchange value sets the price and use values are relevant to price, but there's a tension between the two. That's his starting point. Then you say, with Smith and Ricardo, and what Marx was doing before 1857, they just focused upon the exchange value, and they try to explain capitalism completely in terms of exchange value, where use value is seen as a prerequisite but otherwise irrelevant to economics. What Marx is saying is you've got like the whole lot. Exchange value versus use value. So it's key to understanding capitalism and key to understanding Marx, but it's fundamentally different to how the neoclassicals interpreted use value and exchange value. And what Marx does is give a very good historical and logical explanation of why use value plays no role in setting price for commodities, where you define commodities as things which are produced using other commodities. and which themselves are used to produce commodities. So in that sense, a computer is a commodity these days. This little device, which is a fairly new piece of technology, is not yet a commodity because it's not yet used to produce other commodities. Okay? When you have a new technology coming along, the new technology is made using old technology, but at that early stage when it's being introduced, it's not yet itself used to produce other commodities. Microwaves, for example, when they were first invented, microwave cooking machines weren't used to produce other stuff. 30 years later, every takeaway shop you go to use microwaves. So in the early days, they're not really a commodity. In later days, they are commodities. So Marx is saying for anything which is integrated into a system of production where it's both an input and an output, as a commodity, its value will be set by exchange value. And Marx explains the logic of this in terms of social development over time. He said objects are external to us, so therefore we can alienate them. All we need to do is to agree that we can actually we can exchange these things in trade. In a primitive society, like an ancient Indian community or Peruvian state, exchange is going to occur on the boundaries between two societies. And when that exchange occurs, the utility of something which you can't produce in your society but somebody else can in another society will reflect the price you're willing to pay. But over time, as you continue making exchanges, you go from the exchange rates being a matter of chance to you actually produce surplus elements of this stuff to trade with somebody else. And so he said, if you continue repeating this process of exchanging over time, the constant repetition makes it a normal social act. In the course of time, therefore, you're actually working to produce surplus to your own needs for trade. And you get a distinction between the utility for consumption and its utility for exchange. Its use value becomes distinguished from an exchange value. So in that sense, a world in which use value and exchange value are tied up, Marx says makes sense with primitive societies meeting each other for the first time. And therefore, I've got 40 glass beads here. Would you like to give me Manhattan in return for 40 glass beads? Okay. But you go forward 200 years, here's 40 glass beads for Manhattan, bugger off. Okay. I know how you make glass beads. I'm not about to pay money for them. There's more of a story to the glass beads than just that. But that's the idea. The utility of something matters when you've got exchange being a non-standard event. But if you think about the idea of marginal utility and marginal cost, they actually relate not just to the utility of the purchaser, there's also supposed to be a decline in utility for the seller. Now, do you think Henry Ford felt a decline in utility each time a Model T Ford went out the door? No. Okay? So when you get to production capability, there's the use value of what's being sold for the seller. The only use value it's got is that he can sell it for money. The subjective utility becomes irrelevant. So Marx then said, where does surplus come from? And it wasn't based on the unique properties of labour anymore. He's using his dialectical use value and exchange value to say, where does surplus come from? And this actually occurs in the first 7 chapters of Capital. So saying if you're exchanging equivalents, then the exchange value can't be the source of surplus. Therefore, the only potential source of surplus is the use value. He says the change of value that occurs in the case of money being inserted into capital must take place in the quantity bought by the first act from M to C, but not in its value because you're exchanging equivalents. So we are therefore forced to the conclusion that the change arises in the use value as such as the commodity, i.e. the consumption. In order to extract value from the consumption of a commodity, our friend Moneybags, his archetypal capitalist, must be so lucky as to find a commodity whose use value is the property of being a source of value. Okay. So rather than talking about the unique aspects of labour now, labour versus labour power, he's starting to talk about use value versus exchange value. This is in Capital. He says the past labour that's embodied in labour power and the living labour it can call into action, the daily cost of maintaining it and its daily expenditure work are two totally different things. The former determines the exchange value, the latter is its use value. The fact that half a day's working keeps the labourer alive, does not prevent him working for a whole day. Therefore, the value of labour power and the value it creates are two entirely different magnitudes. And make notice that was a very important word. Two entirely different magnitudes, quantities, not qualitative. It said the useful qualities of labour are important, okay, but that's not what the capitalist is actually buying. What he's buying is the use value, a quantitative use value. It can produce more than it has in itself. And it's all about what's not only what's unique about labour, but what it has in common. The seller of labour power, like the seller of any other commodity, realises its exchange value and parts with its use value. So Marxists, instead of ignored use value, this is Paul Sweezy. It was actually quite a revelation to find this. This isn't, I've forgotten what actual book of Sweezy this is by, but he says, Marx just rejects use value completely. And that's supposed to be a quote from Marx. Use value as such lies outside the sphere of investigation of political economy. So most Marxists, when they read this stuff, they ignore use value, particularly if they've also been advised to ignore the first 7 chapters of Capital. And I just had the guy's name on my tip of my tongue and I've forgotten it. But Marx didn't say that. When you read Marx properly, and I found this before I read Rostolsky, but Rostolsky also found the same thing. He said, it's a tradition to ignore use value. But this is what Marx actually wrote. To be a use value is immaterial. Use value as such, and this is the section, notice the part I've got highlighted there, since it is independent of the determined economic form, lies outside this. So there's a set of phrases, since it is independent of the determined economic form, that was omitted by Sweezy without attribution. And then Marx says it belongs in this sphere when it is also a determinate form. So it was a very selective quote by Sweezy to ignore the role of use value. And Marx himself, fortunately, critiques people who ignored use value in his logic in his marginal notes. So here's Marx commenting on Wagner. Only an obscurantist who has not understood a word of Capital conclude because Marx ignored all the German professorial twaddle on use value, therefore use value plays no role in his work. The obscurantist has ignored that my analysis doesn't stop at the dual mode, but presses forwards, use value, etc., etc. He says, surplus value itself is derived from a specific use value. Okay? So use value plays an important role in my, completely different than in previous political economy. So if you look at this, you've got to see use value being quantitative, and that's again something. I mentioned to you, John was my examiner for my master's thesis, John King, and at the time he was a very staunch Marxist, and he gave a glowing report. He said, "I completely disagree with the conclusions, but I've got nothing but admiration for how the case has been stated." But he wouldn't accept me on this particular point. We haven't had a chance to talk it over yet. But use value is quantitative, and Marx says so. Have this passage here, the past labour that's embodied in labour power and the living labour it can call into action are two totally different things. The former determines the exchange value, the latter is its use value. There's exchange value, that's past labour. There's use value, that's labour it can do in time. They're both quantitative. And Marx says they're incommensurable, rather than saying they're related to each other by marginal terms. They're incommensurable, so use value can be different to exchange value. Normally that means qualitative versus quantitative, so it doesn't matter. But in the production circuit, they're both quantitative. That's the source of surplus in a logical sense for Marx. So it's quantitative. Specific use value of having more value than it has in itself. Okay. And here again, Marx actually uses the word magnitude. The value of labour power and the value it creates are two entirely different magnitudes. I rest my case. Marx is using use value in a quantitative sense in production. So the useful values, they're important, but they're not what actually is meant by use value in that circuit. The use value of a work or anything to a capitalist is not the qualitative side, it's the quantitative. can reduce a physical surplus. And again, exchange value and use value being intrinsically incompatible magnitudes. Now, it stuns me the extent to which people are so willing to hang on to the labour theory of value if they're Marxists. They look at those words and they don't see the word magnitude. Because it's not just neoclassicals I critique for being obsessed with their belief systems. So in the CMC circuit, commodities to money to commodity, use value is qualitative, so you can forget about it. But MCM plus, it's quantitative, it's essential. And that's the first thing is explaining where surplus comes from. So Marx says this about labour. You have labour as a commodity in the MCM plus circuit. Its foreground is exchange value, giving you a subsistence wage. Its background, it can produce commodities for sale. The tension between the two, you can produce a surplus. Okay. Now, and again, Marx says this in terms of, again, his logic, use value, exchange value. There's nothing exploitive about this. The fact that a particular commodity possesses that value can't affect the general law. The value advantage in wages is not merely found again in the product, but it's augmented by surplus value, not because the seller's being defrauded. This is not exploitation. This is just acknowledging the nature of capitalism. So this again is Marx was put down as saying it's all about exploitation. He's richer than that. You got the thing about capital wrong, but he's richer than that. So there's got to be a difference between use value and exchange value. Again, this is, what about a machine? The same logic applies to a machine. So Marx contradicts his own logic. If you think about it, the exchange value of a machine is cost of production. Use value, to produce commodities for sale. There's going to be a gap between use value and exchange value, so a machine can be a short source of surplus value. It's quite simple, quite logical, but it contradicts the labour theory of value. Okay, it means all inputs are a source of production. The contribution of a machine to output will exceed depreciation. And Marx realised that when he first started writing this down. He wrote this at one stage in the Grundrisse. It also has to be postulated the use value of a machine significantly greater than its value. Its devaluation of the service of production is not proportional to its increasing effect upon production. But in attempting to make it consistent with labour theory of value, he made the two equivalent. And this is what stuffed up Marxists for the last 1.5 centuries. So Marx now sees his explanation as transcending Ricardo. He's now explaining where surplus comes from. And I'm going to jump a lot of slides here, as you can see. We haven't got a lot of time. So I want to get on to the logic. He tries to bring it back to this idea that labour is the source of value. But to do it, he's got to contradict his philosophy. And what you see, whenever he's talking about labour, he uses the use value, exchange value dialectic really, really clearly and simply. Whenever he talks about machinery, it's a total mess. And the total mess was enough to confuse Marxists who wanted to believe that labour is the only source of value anyway. So here you see you're talking about the worker sells his commodity, which has a use value. The capitalist attains labour, which is for the exchange value. It's all tied up nice and simply. It all makes sense within those terms. So in the simple circulation, the solid that you've got is changing your utility, and Marx is quite happy to say both parties gain in terms of use value. You get rid of what's not useful for you. Labour itself, without your capacity to do work, is of no use to you if you don't get paid for it. So you give away what's useless to you without machinery and without production system. You get paid to do the work. So you're giving away something of no effective utility to you, and you gain back money and goods which you can buy the means of subsistence, which are useful to you. Okay? In the circuit of capital, you've got money, commodity, more money. The sole object is to increase exchange value, but it's got to be within, equivalents have to be exchanged. Therefore, use value of all the inputs plays an essential role. And again, Marx talks again very clearly about, again, I'll give you this notes rather than trying to read through it given the time we have left. So this is two different processes. CMC and CM plus are two very different circuits. And there's generally an increase in again, both parties gain. They get rid of what's not of no use to them, they get something back useful. So there's good reasons for saying exchange is a transaction by which both sides gain. Now, most non-Marxists wouldn't believe Marx wrote that sentence, but he did. But with exchange value, there's no increase. Equivalents are exchanged. So what Marx is now explaining, first of all, where surplus comes from. But he said profit has to be explained on the basis of the exchange of equivalents. And a lot of Marxists have tried to get around this by saying that labour capital exchanges are between unequals, therefore there's a surplus. Machinery exchanges between equals, therefore there's no surplus. That's an explanation Marx himself would reject. Okay. So you have, again, this is the same quote I've shown you beforehand. And he applies it soundly to machinery, so let's look at it in terms of labour, or machinery rather. The foreground is the exchange value determines its price, the background it can produce commodities for sale, it's going to be a source of surplus value. And there's a quantitative difference, again the same logic I've shown you beforehand. So a machine is another way to harness free energy, and a better way than labour. Once you make a machine that can do what labour does, so long as it more than replaces the labour input, it's more profitable for you, and over time you can increase the energy throughput in a way you can never do with labour, which is why all technological change has been labour replacing. So there's massive verbal gymnastics to try to explain why machinery doesn't produce a surplus. I won't bother you with too much of that, but again, all the slides. It's a verbal barrage, and it just confused enough Marxists, and it fed into their beliefs anyway, so they were happy to stick with it. But it's all bullshit, pardon me. This is just, okay. It's confusion of depreciation with value contribution, all these sorts of things. And so here's him saying effectively equating depreciation to productive contribution. It's just a turgid load of phrases that ends up saying that they lose in their labour process the original form of the use value, only just assume the form of new use value. So he's now making the use value passed over by the machine to be qualitative. It's metaphysical. It's not realistic at all. But it was enough to confuse Marxists and end up with this particular statement. Okay? So, a mere use value. So suddenly he's denigrating use value and he'd made it have an important role elsewhere. So there's lots of crap in Marx, okay? Neoclassicals don't have a monopoly on crap in their logic. But if you get rid of the crap in Marx, you get a much more worthwhile theory. Get rid of the crap in neoclassicals, there's nothing left. Actually reminds me of one of my favourite jokes. It's an Irish joke. What's a leprechaun? It's an Australian with the shit beaten out of him. Pardon me. Okay. A joke of here in Ireland, if you see Ireland versus Australia in a football match. Okay. So all this stuff is just the usual crap. I go through a lot of the logic here. And to have a look through it yourself, you'll see how much Marx is using verbal gymnastics to confuse people. But I want to go on to the positive stuff now before we finish, because I can see this as a way of organising the concepts of how you explain where surplus comes from, how you explain wage determination, how you explain new products and so on. It all fits together beautifully. So we get rid of all this crap. This is going to annoy people on YouTube no end, but sorry guys. I'll put the slides up on Patreon. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. So the reason I've gone through all this is because I think we can actually get a good philosophical foundation for building a new economics now, starting with the work on energy, but then going through explaining, for example, why wages exceed subsistence. And Marx actually had this all the way through. In a thermodynamic sense, wages have to exceed subsistence, because if all you get is enough to stay alive, you've got no energy left to do any work. Okay? You've got to be paid enough to have enough energy left over to use that energy in production. So of course that's why wages should exceed subsistence. But you also get subjective pricing of commodities, all sorts of interesting arguments. Look at wages. Most Marxists tend to assume that wages are equal to the value of labour power, i.e. subsistence. Okay. Whenever Marx, I know because I read everything Marx wrote in economics, on 7 occasions he compared the value of labour power to the wage. Every last time he said the minimum wage. Okay. The worker, and this is explaining what he's doing in Volume 1 of Capital. Necessary labour supposed as such, the worker always receives only the minimum of wages. That's necessary to explain the laws of profit, absent from the rise and fall of wages or the influence of landed property. We forget about this in future. This is written in the Grundrisse. The natural price of labour is nothing but the minimum wage. This is before the Grundrisse. This is after the Grundrisse in the theories of surplus value. The value of labour power is equal to the minimum of wages. The minimum wage, alias the value of labour power. So throughout he's saying the value of labour power is the minimum wage. So how can it be consistent? Well, that's another dialectic, because the worker is both a commodity and a non-commodity. It's a commodity because it's essential for production. It's a non-commodity because your parents didn't have you so that they could sell you for a profit. Though the thought might have occurred to them from time to time. So if you get a pure commodity, you're paid a subsistence wage, but you're a non-commodity, you'll demand a share in the surplus. So the tension between the two is a struggle over the minimum wage, social wage, etc., etc. And therefore wages will normally exceed subsistence, only in an absolutely defeated sense. The workers only get their means of subsistence. And therefore you get income distribution turning up as a necessary part of the dynamic. So you've got labour in capitalist society. The foreground aspect, you focus upon it being the commodity you pay a subsistence wage. The background is we're not just commodities, we're not apples, we're not oranges. We organise, we demand a share in the surplus. You're going to get a struggle over the distribution of income. And that's pretty much the Goodwin model I've shown you initially. So you now get an explanation not for the difference between labour and labour power. It doesn't explain where surplus comes from. It explains why there's a minimum wage and workers struggling for more than the minimum wage, and why income distribution struggles turn up as part of what turns up in capitalism. And I got an intriguing paper to a referee from a physics journal about more than a decade ago, back in 2004. 2003 I received the paper, and these physicists they attempted to build a statistical model of income distribution, and it had two components to it. One was investment returns, and that followed a power law. The other was trade, and they found that they could only explain the data if the trade part involved the poor being paid more than the rich. And they couldn't comprehend it. And I was a bit stunned by it initially too, because I thought the workers would be ripped off, usual semi-Marxist type explanation. But they actually found that workers are paid more than their value. And this made sense from Marx's point of view. So they tried to make this model with two parts, by investment and by trading. Investment, any act that creates or destroyed wealth, trade in any type of economic transaction. They found that all trades, it appears, may be a transfer of wealth from one party to another, so the richer could gain at the expense of the poor, or vice versa. In a trade transaction, it's bounded because it can't extort the wealth of the poorer of the two traders. And what they found is the price is socially determined in such ways the trade is statistically biased in favour of the poorer trader. And I suggested to them, well, there's an interpretation of this that makes sense, which comes out of Marx. And so you find them quoting, this because of my referee's feedback, they quoted Marx in this argument. So there's an economic bias in favour of workers, because if workers only receive the subsistence wage, they wouldn't be able to produce, they wouldn't be able to work in the first place. So this means that this explains where this particular concept of Marx came from. The fact that you talk about these cycles in income distribution and wages makes sense from his dialectical point of view. It doesn't make sense from a labour theory of value point of view. So effective demand, once you've produced the goods, this is your point earlier, you've got to turn them into money. So it's got a higher value, but to realise that, you've got to turn those commodities into money. And so there's a realisation problem. The transformation problem is bullshit. It just comes out of believing the labour theory of value. But there's a real problem in turning goods, you produce surplus commodities, okay? You've got more outputs than inputs, but you want to turn that into money. To turn it into money, there must be demand for it. So there's now a barrier the commodity has to be a use value, and not just in the individual sense of being useful. There's got to be sufficient demand for it to mean you actually realise and make the profit you were trying to make. So Marx has all this logic. As a new value in value, it's got a problem in terms of equivalence, so there's a second value. This is in the Grundrisse. And so to be a use, it has to be a use value. Utility turns up. Surplus money has to be exchanged for surplus value. So you find the bottom line here, use value now dominates exchange value. And therefore you get a realisation problem, which is pretty much the problem of effective demand. So putting that in here, we now have in the CMC circuit, you've got commodities, they've got to be a use value, but they're produced to generate a profit. So you might not realise that surplus. So you've got the whole problem of effective demand. And that inverts the importance of use value and exchange value at this stage. And money. Marx is often interpreted as having the commodity view of money. Money reflects the value of labour. That's what you find in De Brunhoff and papers like that. But Marx actually has a credit theory of money. And he says, what does the industrial capitalist pay for loan capital? Remember that example I gave about the New Zealand petrol station owner getting $10 million because the worker pressed one less key. Marx is aware of that. What is the price of loan capital? What the buyer of an ordinary commodity buys is its use value. What he pays for is its exchange value. He's leaving the word out there. What the borrowed money pays for is likewise its use value. What does he pay for it? Surely not its price. Okay? Because the cost of producing money is trivial. So Marx then says, its use value, they're paying its use value. And its use value is its prospective profitability. Okay? So the value of money or commodities depends not on their value, but the quantity of surplus value they produce for the owner. And so you're going to get is the value of money is set by its use value. And here's Marx again. This is Marx on the actual product. It must always be borne in mind that here capital is a commodity. All the relations will be irrational from the standpoint of an ordinary commodity. So he's talking about commodities versus non-commodities. The first non-commodity is labour, but another non-commodity is capital, money. Okay? Because you need money for exchange, but you don't produce it using other goods and services. Yeah?
Can I apply the same to the cryptocurrencies like bitcoins and mints that were released recently? Don't you think so?
Yeah, that's a similar sort of thing. That's valuation is set by what people think.
It's like a digital currency so far.
Yeah.
It's just
But any commodity, any money at all, its value far exceeds its cost of production.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So he says, well, if you want to call interest the price of money capital, then it's an irrational form of price, quite at variance with the concepts of price of commodities. So he's making distinctions here all the way through. So how can a product have a price that's not its value? And here is Marx. What is sold is its use value, which in this case is to produce exchange value, more value than itself contains. And that's the price you're willing to pay for money. So you get subjective expectations and uncertainty turning up in Marx. And you get a dialectic of money, which you now can look at. So that's saying that you have the MCM plus circuit. Money is your input here. It's a commodity, it's essential for exchange, but it's a non-commodity. You can't produce it by means of other commodities. So its exchange value is set by its use value, and its use value involves expectations and uncertainty. Okay, and then Marx again on the same point. There are no natural limits for the rate of interest. So again, he's not seeing it as a price. Again, this is consistent with Keynes and with post-Keynesian logic rather than the natural rate of interest stuff with the neoclassicals.
There is what? There are no natural limits.
Yeah. But he's saying the maximum limit is the profit itself. Okay? Interest rate above the rate of profit, you're going to have problems in capitalism. But there's no market price for the price of interest, which again, the minimum level is also indeterminable. There'll be counteracting influences. Again, this is much richer than people realise Marx was on money, far richer. The trivialised stuff of seeing money as being labour power just leaves out the great richness that you can find in Marx's logic. And this is all, it's the whole lot. Everything from, it's in Capital, which has got, of course, got 3 volumes. Theories of Surplus Value, which has 3 volumes, and the Grundrisse. So there's 7 about this thick you'd need to read to get the whole lot, but it's all there. So here is again talking about what do you pay for a mine? The compensation given for a mine or quarry is paid for the value. This is Ricardo. Has no connection with the original and indestructible powers of the land. And Marx says no. There's a very significant connection. The word value is totally ugly here. He said an undeveloped mine has no value in it. Ricardo never uses value for usefulness. So he's saying, are you paying compensation for the labour that's gone into it when there's no labour at all? Then you invalidate your entire doctrine of value. What does value mean here is it must do the possible use value and hence prospective exchange value. It's all about expectations, uncertainty. Okay. So the price you're willing to pay on a capital asset depends upon what you think you'll make out of it, which is uncertain. You're getting, again, a precursor of Keynes here in uncertainty. And therefore...
But also because maybe there's some kind of risk measurement, some kind of strengths as well.
Yeah. So you get possible use value, prospective exchange value, all these terms. So you get several price levels turning up. The dialectic of the commodity gives you the existence of a surplus, and the commodities are there for exchanging at their values. That's Raffian pricing, if you like. The dialectic of labour gives you labour getting more than the minimum wage. The dialectic of money and capital gives you exchange value set by prospective use value. And you can also extend it further, which Marx didn't actually do himself, to look at innovation, because a commodity is something which is produced for sale and is also used as an input for other commodities. Now Ricardo is more precise here, because he'd say some things like wine or statues and so on, the prices are set entirely independently of the labour that goes into making them. So Ricardo did have this concept, and in effect neoclassicals made this sort of stuff the basis of their entire theory of value. Okay, so we price everything as though we're pricing Picassos. I'm sorry, these are not Picassos. Okay. But there can be a subjective price level for some products. So the Austrian idea it plays a role, because if you have a new product, then yes, it's a non-commodity, because it's not yet used to produce other commodities, but it is produced by other commodities. So you can have a price set by its subjective utility. I'm willing to pay a very high price for a new toy like this, which I bought about 6 months ago, and it's one of the most useful. I hope it's useful. Do you like me being able to highlight? I think it's cool.
You're much quicker with it.
But yeah, it's cool. Rather than just a pointer, let's give it a try here. Okay, new products. I can highlight, and that, because I can't make the scale of godly tables bigger at the moment in Minsky, I can amplify it with this, and that's really helps dramatically. So I'm willing to pay a high price for that, but in future, I want this at the cost of production. So you get all this components of non-commodities, labour turning up, and I'm being told to shut up by the looks of things.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is the last complete informal session before you go into your wrap-up, and therefore we thought we'd hand you over our gift that we prepared. One is a liquor from Neudietendorf, and the other one, a coffee from the Zinzendorf House.
Okay.
Thank you very much for being with us throughout this week, and enjoy your last minutes with the thief. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I'll save myself and carry that back in the bag. We'll finish that over drinks tonight. What do you reckon? Okay. Well, there's more there, but I'll leave it at that. So I hope that's been useful. And you've all got a copy of the slides, I think. I'll get a data stick off somebody here, a USB stick, but I've actually made a few changes, so just in terms of the sequence. So I'll put that on a data stick now and pass it around.
And also some, I think in Minsky, some examples you
Yeah.
didn't include. So is it alright if you could somehow send us?
I'll put those all on the same data stick, USB stick, and pass them around. And when I've got a Patreon blog now, because I'm going to be ceasing working at Kingston. I'm actually already on 1/4 pay. And as of next year, I'm going to be doing everything I'm doing right now, but self-financed through Patreon. So I put all the stuff on the Patreon blog, and that's easy with Patreon to link up to the slides and to all the files. Much easier than YouTube.
Some kind of just Google Drive.
Pardon?
Maybe you've got some Google Drive, for instance.
I can do that as well. Yeah, but they'll all be on Patreon too.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.